Yeah, so let's continue this conversation around how the moral imagination, in particular of the West, has been radically transformed, and speak to how men and women interacted, and specifically about sexual ethics. The way that we think about sex now, we use terms like consent, which you talk about in your book, is radically different than, again, how a Plato or Aristotle would have thought of it.
Well, I mean, it was a very scary world, and the economy of the ancient world, let's say in Rome, kind of revolved around sexual exploitation, and there,
Hmm.
there were even state-sponsored brothels because it was considered to be for the good of the male citizenry of Rome to have free and easy access to inferior bodies, um, and so, I mean, brothels were absolutely ubiquitous. They were everywhere, and it would a visit to a brothel would cost about the price of a loaf of bread. Um, there are 25 Latin words for prostitute, and yet in Latin there is no natural way to refer to an adult male virgin.
Hmm.
If you refer to an adult virgin, it is assumed that you're referring to a female. Like an adult male virgin is not a thing in the Roman world, and so the sexual mores of ancient Rome were very much it was a world of shame and not of sin, and that's a
Hmm.
kind of a conceptualization that's brought out by historian Kyle Harper, who wrote a brilliant book called From Shame to Sin, and um, you don't want to be shameful, and so um, a man who overindulged his sexual appetites, um, like he would be called effeminate, right?
Hmm.
Um, but there was an absolute sexual double standard. Men were assumed to be able to possess the bodies of anyone who was their inferior. Women, on the other hand, were expected to be chaste. They were expected to be virgins when they married. They probably didn't have to wait very long. Marriage at 12 was very common
Hmm.
in the Roman world. And it's into that context that Jesus comes and, Matthew 19, he's just like, he equalizes the sexes in the most extraordinary way.
Hmm.
And he expects men to be as chaste as women had always been expected to be. And when he unfolds his sexual ethic in Matthew 19, he just basically says, one man, one woman for life, and that's it. And then, the disciples, many of whom were married, said, oh, it would be better if we weren't married, which I always think is funny. Like, as soon as Matthew publishes his
It
gospel,
is a
I
funny
wonder what the
moment.
wives thought,
Yeah.
you know, like, and then people would say, isn't there any other sexual outlets? And Jesus is like, no, you could. I mean, you could be a eunuch for the kingdom, but that's that. It's either chaste singleness or it's marriage.
So
But
if I'm
what's
track
fascinating? Yeah, go on.
No, I'd say so. If I'm tracking with you, you're saying, look, in the ancient world, men had not just sexual freedom; they had freedom to what, from our view, we would describe as oppress other individuals, other women, boys, as long as they were within their charge, or if they were going to a brothel, they had the right to express themselves sexually, and this was seen actually as a moral, good, normal thing. And what you're describing in the Jesus Revolution is not that Jesus came along and said, "Okay, women, now you can be just as sexually exploitative as men are." Instead, he called men to a higher standard and said, "No, you need to be chaste as women are chaste. You need to, just as they do, embrace an ethic of consent." And in a real way, and I thought this was fascinating in your book, this gives us the category that we hear so much of today, which is abuse. The idea that someone could sexually misuse someone else. So could you talk a little bit about abuse and how that comes out of Christianity, or the concept of abuse comes out of Christianity?
Right. Well, you need to have a doctrine of the equality of the sexes. You need to have a doctrine of the inviolable human rights of every
Hmm.
person. You need to have a doctrine that victims have a special status and dignity, and that we must protect them. You must think that sex is meaningful, such that a violation of someone sexually is a really egregious
Hmm.
sin against a person. You have to believe some very distinctive things to have a category for abuse, and all those things have been given to us by Christianity. In the ancient world, pederasty was celebrated. Now, the Greek word means love of children. Pederasty means love of children, and it was this thing that was celebrated by all the ancient writers, where older men would induct usually younger men, younger boys, into the ways of sexuality in a way that we would just in an unqualified way consider to be abuse, and the kind of abuse that would put you behind bars for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
This was celebrated in the ancient world. It was called pederasty, child love. Christians and Jews called it paidophthorria, which means child destruction.
Mm.
So what was celebrated in the ancient world as love, Christians denounced as abuse. And really, once Christianity took hold in the Roman Empire and there were Christian emperors, it started to be a crime to abuse certainly members of your household, but also if there are slaves in the household. It was a crime that slaves, even decades after their abuse, could come forward and make allegations, and there would be a crime that was known as child destruction back in the day. But to an ancient Roman who knew nothing of the gospel, who knew nothing of the Bible or the teachings of Christ, these things would not, they didn't have a category for it. It was invisible. Abuse was happening all the time. Violation of bodies was happening all the time. But there was no category. It just wasn't a thing. And when you think about it,
do you feel politically homeless?
Join the club.
Both parties are becoming more tribal and neither fully represent the values of Jesus. Christians need a path forward that leaves partisanship behind.
That's why we wrote Truth Over Tribe, pledging allegiance to the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. Together, we can end tribalism.
Pre-order the book on Amazon and let's start a movement.
The Me Too movement or any kind of popular consciousness of the evils, the utter unconscionable evils of abuse, whether it's of a child or of anyone, that unconscionable evil only makes sense if you believe certain things, that sex is a really meaningful thing, that bodies are like temples, that men and women are equal, that victims have a special status, that power should not be used to dominate others, but should be used to serve and protect. You've got to believe the most profoundly Christian things in order to believe in sexual abuse. And it's been brought home to me recently. There's a great book by Louise Perry, who
we're going to have her on the podcast soon.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, no, she's absolutely brilliant. And I think she describes herself as a materialist feminist. And one of the things that sort of put her on the path that she's on in writing a book that she's just written that's called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, is she worked in a rape crisis center for most of her 20s. And she saw the evil of sexual abuse. But if it's evil with a capital E, then there's got to be something that's good with a capital G. What standards do we have that we are using in order to, because it's one of the kind of moral certainties that we have. We don't have very many moral certainties anymore, but child sexual abuse is probably the great moral certainty that we have at the moment. And yet, why is it so evil? Well, it because it violates some profoundly Christian ideals that we all have. And so when we are outraged at abuse, it is a particularly Christian outrage that we're feeling.
Yeah, it's the air that we breathe. It's the water we're swimming in. If someone came to you and asked, why are you so offended by this abuse? Frankly, you probably wouldn't have a conversation with that person. Say, well, if you don't understand this fundamental reality, we're going to have a hard time conversing about it. And again, I think the point you're drawing out is that seems fundamental because we have so deeply drunken in these waters. We have so deeply breathed in the air of Christian ethics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Germaine Greer, for instance, she's an Australian and a feminist. I'm Australian as well, but she she got into such hot water for saying, what's the big idea with sexual abuse? What's the big deal? And she got into such hot water for saying what actually on her moral presuppositions and the moral presuppositions of her critics should have been just logically, it should logically follow that if you don't think bodies are temples and if you don't think sex is special, then why is rape so bad? You know, if I force you to play a game of tennis with me, I'm just weird, right? But if I force you to have sex with me, I'm a rapist.
Mm.
And we acknowledge that there's something radically different between rape and a weird game of tennis, because there's something radically different about sex. There's something very special. What is so special about it? You know, I'm old enough to remember the song "You and Me, Baby, We Ain't Nothing But Mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel." And what we're left with in the modern day, when we still have the sensibility that sexual abuse is wrong, thank God, is "You and Me, Baby, We Ain't Nothing But Mammals, so let's honor one another's sexual boundaries at all times. And you're like, that
Hold
just
on.
doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it doesn't work. Now, I can imagine someone at this point, as we're talking through how Christianity really is the foundation upon which we build concepts like human rights. It's where we get concepts like abuse. But I can imagine someone saying, look, the church has just perpetrated terrible evils in history. You know, they might think of the forced baptisms that Charlemagne did, or the Crusades, or enslavement, or the Spanish Inquisition, or the religious wars that happened, you know, after the Reformation, and say, look at all this tremendous evil caused by Christianity. So sure, you can try to tell me that you've created our moral foundations, but come on. I mean, let's be honest here.
Yeah, and that's important for people to point out. And the point at that stage is not for Christians to say, yeah, but we haven't been as bad as the other guys down the road. That would be a very foolish and wrong response to make to that. What I do in the book is absolutely acknowledge sometimes Christians have been the worst abusers in the world, and very often the cover-ups of abuse have been as egregious as the abuse itself.
Yes.
And we have so much blood on our hands. One of the things I do in the consent chapter is quote from Rachel Den Hollander, who blew the whistle on Larry Nassar, who, as far as serial abusers go, it's hard to find somebody who has abused as many women and girls as Larry Nassar has, and he is behind bars for the rest of his life. In the victim impact statement that she made back in 2017, I believe, Rachel Den Hollander, who is a Christian, she quotes from C.S. Lewis in her 17-minute victim impact statement. And if people haven't heard that 17 minutes, go to YouTube and find it. It's just it's a gut punch, but it is such a necessary gut punch. And she refers people to what C.S. Lewis said about evil. Evil is like crooked lines. And if you never had the idea of a straight line, you would never have the idea of a crooked line. Lines would just be lines if there's no straight line against which we're judging crooked lines to be crooked. If there's no straight lines, the lines are just lines. And what do you expect? And by parallel, things are evil, things are wrong, things are crooked in a moral sense only if there is something that is straight. And Rachel says, Larry Nassar, I can judge what you've done as evil, and evil with a capital E, because I know what the straight line is. And what is the straight line? The straight line is that bodies are temples and sex is special and men and women are equal and victims have a special status and power should be used to serve and not to dominate. That is the straight line. And you can do it with all these great evils, the Crusades, Why is it so egregious to go to war with your enemy rather than persuade your enemy? Why is that? Well, it's the straight line of the cross, that banner under which they fought, that judges what the Crusaders did as morally unconscionable. But to enact the Crusades under any other banner is not problematic at all. To do it under the banner of Genghis Khan or a Julius Caesar or an Alexander the Great, or even under a Muhammad, that is not morally problematic, actually. These things are morally problematic because of the straight line by which we're judging them to be crooked. And so I think it's a mistake for Christians when they're attacked for these things to minimize and say, it's not really so bad after all. I think the real response is to say, it's even worse than you think. This is not just a moral crime. This is a sin against Christ and against the way of Christ that has been, that is ultimately woven into the fabric of the cosmos. And to the degree that we name the crookedness of these things, I think is the degree to which we can then point to the straight line. and say these things are really crooked because Christ really is that good. So that's my approach in the book. It's not to be an apologist for any of these things. I raise crusades, and I raise the Inquisition, I raise the treating of Galileo, and I raise church abuse, and I raise all these things.
Yeah.
But it is, as we press into the crookedness of this thing, hopefully people then hang on to you as they see that you are honest and able to admit error, to then say, now can we talk about the standards by which we're judging this? And let's look to Christ, the straight line.